We're pleased to welcome back Dr. John Worth. As many of you might know, he for quite a few years was the assistant director of the Randall Research Center out at Pineland. And so we were very fortunate when he lived down here in South Florida, and you could get John to talk almost any month, as long as you could get in touch with him. Now we have to bring him in once a year or sometimes twice. Currently he's an associate professor of historical archaeology in the Department of Anthropology at the University of West Florida up in Pensacola. And he also specializes in the archaeology and ethnohistory of the Spanish colonial era, which of course is our theme for today. I'm not sure that he'll be mentioning it here, but one of his very recent discoveries, which garnered a great deal of publicity, was the discovery of the 1559 to 1561 Tristan de Luna settlement, which was discovered just a little over a year ago at this point. John is a Georgia native, and he received his doctorate from the University of Florida and spent 15 years in public archaeology before joining the faculty at University of West Florida. Dr. John Worth.
All right, thanks, Teresa. So 25 minutes.
No, you get your full time.
Okay, well, all right, I'll do what I can. I want to talk about a subject that I've done a lot about in the past. It was the subject of my dissertation, which I later expanded into a 750-page long book manuscript, which is a 2-volume set, now out of print, unfortunately. But it's fairly, I've looked at it a lot in the past, but I had to refresh myself in the present. So I'm going to try to time this right so I get it all so that I know what my target is. Okay. What I want to do is explain to you to some extent why in 1656 the chief of the Timucua province in North Florida, Lucas Menendez, decided to issue an order to have all the Spanish soldiers and their helpers murdered, which sparked a rebellion that lasted something like 8 months and eventually led to his death and that of all of the other chiefs that followed him. And why he spared explicitly all the Franciscan friars who had been among them. And why he said that it would be 6 years before he could let the Spaniards back in, but then he would be okay. Anyway, that complicated question and that intriguing scenario led me down a long, long path to basically try to figure out how that rebellion illustrated the nature of Spanish Florida's colonial system, and specifically what role the missions had in establishing and maintaining the Spanish colony, and what Spanish Florida itself was essentially a massively multi-ethnic colony with 95% plus Native American population and only 2,500, maybe as many as 3,000 Spaniards at any given time. So anyway, this is just an overview. I want to kind of briefly scan through so that you'll have some context. This is the maximal extent of Spanish Florida after 1587, which is when the Franciscans really began to expand. And I just show that because that's kind of the framework. That's a sum total of where the Franciscans went and where Spaniards set up shop, essentially, during this period. Just to give you a sense of the structural element of how this all worked in the mid-17th century, which is when our rebellion is going to be I'm going to be talking about. This is an illustration, a kind of a distilled version of a much more complicated figure that deals with the actual political relationships that were established between what the Spaniards knew as the Republic of Indians and then the Republic of Spaniards. So what we're dealing with here, and I want you to focus on the dotted lines, is that the Spanish chiefs who requested universally, once the Spaniards were here, say a generation later, they universally requested the presence of a Franciscan friar who wanted to establish a subordinate relationship with the King of Spain. This was all about their increase in internal autonomy and power, or at least that's what they wanted, was more power over their own provinces. And by surrendering obedience to the King of Spain, they thought they would maintain a large degree of autonomy. However, the Spanish crown, of course, maintained a military garrison, and the governor and captain general of Florida was the representative of the king, and theoretically was not on par with the chiefs. The chiefs considered them natural nobility. And so I guess my point is, to set all this up, the original sort of contract, maybe unspoken with the chiefs, was that the chiefs would surrender to the King of Spain. They would become vassals, but in the end, they thought that they would be largely in control of their own destinies. Furthermore, As a part of this, Franciscans, of course, were the brokers, the agents between the chiefs and the governor locally. And so the friars each one friar entered each capital village under the secular power of the chief. So these were not mission villages, they were villages that had a missionary. They were Christian, the missionary handled religious affairs, but the chief still controlled secular affairs. And whenever the Franciscans messed around with any aspect of that, they tended to get in trouble. So here's the thing, the mission chiefdoms thought they had more autonomy and power than the Florida governor probably believed they did. And the Florida governor, definitely most of them, believed that they had a lot more power over the Indians than they actually were supposed to have. The Franciscans constantly, or whenever they were asked to, would rat out bad soldiers or abusive practices to their superiors in Spain. So the Franciscans were at odds with the military, and the military they were always fighting with each other, and the natives were in the middle of all this. And anyway, I'll get to more, but I'm trying to make this fairly brief. Just to show you the concept of vassalage, the concept of tribute, the concept of noble chiefs is not something new when the Spanish arrived. The Spanish simply adapted an existing system and became the paramount chiefs over existing Timucuan and Appalachian, Wale, and Mocama chiefdoms. This is years ago at least, my reconstruction of how the Timucua province was organized politically, where you have essentially small clusters of villages, each of which have a headman, which in Timucua would be Horata? Yeah. Anyway, so the point is that there's a secondary level that may or may not be kind of a permanent regional chief, which is above all the other cluster chiefs. So there's essentially 3 levels, local chief and then a regional chief. Lucas Menendez, the guy I'm talking about, was a regional chief and essentially the preeminent one in that period. The way the Timucua noble system worked is very complicated, and thanks to Franciscan ethnographic attempts, we have a lot of information about the lineages, the nobility, the degree of nobility, the rankings of the various families and familial offices. Chiefs didn't rule alone, essentially. They had counselors, etc. And I have some beautiful names up here out of these texts, but of course, and I don't know what they all mean. I'd love to know more, but we don't know anthropologically how it all worked in the inside of this system, but I guess my main point is it's a very sophisticated, detailed, well-known system to the Timucuans, which the Spaniards, to some extent, peripherally knew something about, and they actually did try to maintain it. The Spaniards were not about changing their culture in the political realm so much as maintaining the native societies as a source of food, as a source of labor, and as ultimately as a source of expanding Christianity, etc. Anyway, the way the political structure was actually glued together was, of course, through subsistence, economic means. And so this is just a diagram that illustrates in general what I've been able to reconstruct about Timucuan chiefdoms, little Timucuan chiefdoms of maybe 1,500 people scattered across North Florida. And this sort of mimics what a lot of other of the Florida native groups would have been doing as well. Each family lineage, matrilineages, would have had their own plots of land that they were working. And that product, the corn, essentially was the main economic glue. The corn that was produced ultimately, of course, fed the family, and the family, as the family grew, it had more laborers. And the point, though, is that the chief had his field or her field, because they had female chiefs since they were hereditary, farmed for him or her, and therefore there was a system of public finance. They even planted a separate field when the friars came in for the church, and another field for the public officials. And then also there were other ways. Later the Spanish imposed, imposed a system of widows and orphans field, so that the people who didn't have any means of providing for themselves via their own husband, for example, or their own parents, could actually be provided for. This is a system of public finance that was ancient. Well, maybe a few hundred years old, less than 100 years old among the Timucua, but it was very, very ancient in the southeast. The point, though, is that the way the system worked in the mission period is that the Spaniards essentially skimmed off the top. Without taking it, they actually purchased it via trade goods, gifts, clothes, iron axes, etc. And so the surplus from the mission provinces was being transported mostly by ship, since it's pretty heavy to move that much corn. We're talking 1 million pounds of corn or more every year. Anyway, the way it worked on the broader scale is that the mission provinces did their thing. Some of the corn was shipped by sea to the royal warehouses, where it was, of course, then distributed to the garrison, which didn't really have its own means of production as much. But in addition, there was a whole other system, another component, where the labor in the system, the people walked literally on foot and became part of the repartimiento system, which is essentially an annual labor draft. So about 300, by the mid-century, 300 or so mission Indians, unmarried young males, would be chosen by the chiefs, sent to St. Augustine for 3 months, 4 months, maybe 6 months of service. And then the chief would go back, gather up their wages in the form of all these wonderful trade goods, and bring it back and decide whether they wanted to distribute those to the workers or to other people that they favored. Anyway, the point is, it was not like slavery. It was essentially, though, a labor system that had the chiefs as the intermediaries. Therefore, the chiefs were far more powerful, because by being part of this bigger system, the chiefs actually maintained authority as a go-between. Anyway, that's important, because when that system starts to break down, that's when you see the rebellion. So the way it looked on the landscape is this. You see the various provinces to the west, the land transport of people moving in, and then you see the maritime transport. The Spaniards would religiously send ships to supply the Franciscans and then buy extra corn from the natives. All right, and in regard to the population levels, these are actual census numbers or estimates that show from 1600 all the way to 1700, which shows the increase in population estimated within the mission system up to a maximum of 30,000 at any given time. But what you'll note, of course, is the diminishing of that population in the last half of the 17th century. Now, what you have to remember is that this first half is the expansion period of the mission system. So the growth in population numbers is largely or partly due to more people coming into the system. And they were definitely dying off in the system. And even though the 16th century, as Dr. Francis pointed out, doesn't have a lot of explicit references to epidemics, there are quite a few specific epidemic references through the 17th century, and I'll mention one later. But the point is that as people died on the near shore, near St. Augustine, as the wave of missions pushed farther out, they gathered new populations, and then sometimes they moved them back toward the center to replace those that had died because of earlier contacts. I mean, this seems to be going on as a pattern. It's like a shock wave as it expands out to a certain point. That's the population, though. So just to show you, and again, very briefly, I'm going to walk through sort of a series of maps that will show you the spatial positioning of all of this. There's the missions as of 1606, basically coastal, and a little bit inland on the St. Johns River. These are Timucua speakers, Mocama in this area, the Agua Salada, the saltwater here, which is actually, well, I'm sorry, the Agua Dulce, the freshwater province, and then Wale up here. We jump to 1633, right before the missionization of the Appalachee. You see that they've expanded into the interior of Georgia. All of the Timucua region, even up here in the Ocklawaha River toward Ocala, all are now within the domain of the mission system. Then, as of 1650, or right before 1657, this is the maximal extent. You see there's been retreat here, but now Appalachia is part of the mission system. Now, what I'm going to do now, though, is walk my way to the end just to show you what happens afterward, and then I'm going to go back and focus in on the rebellion itself. And that, by the way, is just shows you that transportation network I pointed out before. There's the rebellion. That's where the murders occurred. That's where the hangings occurred. That's where the trials, the stockade was built, which I'll talk about in a moment. But I show this now because what it shows you is that the whole system was dependent on the free flow of people and goods throughout that. And what the Timucuan Rebellion did, and why it was so important, was because it cut Appalachia, the dense 30,000 rich population of Appalachia, it cut them off from St. Augustine. And it was very, very important. And so the point is that by losing the Timucua province during this big rebellion, which actually only ended up in the deaths of 7 victims in the actual start of the rebellion, it still nonetheless threatened the stability of the system via the network of transportation routes that you see there. Now, again, afterwards, and I'll show you why this happens, the missions begin to contract as a direct result of the mission rebellion having been quelled, and I'll explain that momentarily. Later, you see slave raiding that hits the mission, all in various points between 1661 on the Georgia coast through the 1680s when the Creeks get involved in the Yamasee. And then finally, in 1698, Pensacola is established, Charleston has been established, and there's more raiding during this period. So, and in this case, it's actually the governor of South Carolina who marches armies down with Creek warriors to wipe out the northern missions and then finally the Appalachee province later. So, what happened? Well, missions went away. They retreated. We're going to talk about that more after lunch. Dr. Milanich and I both have presentations that focus on the refugees. And then finally, you can see by the end of the first Spanish period, Spanish Florida is just 3 colonial settlements with outlying mission groups. And none, in fact, none of the people even left in South Florida. Now, just to show you the details, this is the province that was subject to the actual rebellion in 1656. Make sure my timing's good. So what you can see is St. Augustine here. Here's the northern missions on the coastal region. There's the St. Johns River. The Timucua province is essentially this zone. There was a little mission down here near the mouth of the Suwannee, which came and went, but doesn't show up later. But this is the heart of the Timucua Mission Province. It's beginning in the pre-1616 era. You see the expansion up to 1630, and you note that this is a very broadly distributed set of missions. And each one of these missions, they weren't distributed that way by the Franciscans. These were the chiefdoms of the Timucua, established at watering holes and good springs and areas where there were good clay soils that they could farm. They did produce corn and beans, etc., prior to contact, but apparently not too many decades before. And corn agriculture hadn't reached that area before about 1450 or so, at least based on our current data. Now, there's the network details of the roads, the actual roads we can document using the testimony mostly out of the rebellion. And so what you see is that to get to all the missions, you had to wander. I mean, Arapaha was on the Alapaha River in South Georgia. You know, no coincidence there. Near Valdosta was Cachipile, Chamile, Urijica. All of these were very broadly distributed. So in other words, the Spaniards went to the Indians, and there is where they set up their missions. Then Appalachia, of course, is over here, and there's a gateway here at Asile. The point I'm making here, though, is that the rebellion allowed the Spanish to correct this deficit, this problem with the transportation network. It opened up the possibility of, in one fell swoop, sweeping all of these far-flung provinces, or towns rather, into the main road and putting them directly under Spanish supervision and distributing them nicely as way stations. So, that's the system as it existed in 1656. In 1656, Governor Diego de Rebolledo had been there for 2 years in Florida. He was originally from Cartagena in modern-day Colombia, and he came into a Florida that, of course, had well-established traditions and, of course, which had been missionized, among the Timucua at least, for almost half a century. Well, no, exactly half a century. But what happened was in the short 2 years that Rebolledo was governor before the rebellion, he apparently chose that he was going to be more corrupt than most of the other previous Florida governors had been. It was expected, and you shouldn't be too hard on them. Florida was a deep frontier, the most backward place in the Spanish Empire anyone would ever want to go. In fact, no one ever did want to go there, and most who were here in Florida wanted to leave. A lot of letters from people saying, get me out of this place. In any case, he decided, apparently learned very early on, that the Appalachee province provided all the food, and it had port access, and it was a very rich and abundant place. Also had trade with the interior creeks. Point is, Appalachia was important, and the governor actually also found out that there was ambergris, part of a whale that washes up on the southeast coast of Florida, and that the Ais Indians, who were not converted, were collecting. And so the point, though, is that he took to himself the idea that he was going to focus on those provinces and those native groups that gave him the best potential for enrichment. But the Timucua province, which had already been devastated by a lot of diseases, he didn't pay as much attention to. So, in that context, when the chief arrived to pay obedience or fealty or get his gifts from the incoming governor, he got less than all of the other chiefs around him. And it irked him, apparently. It stuck in his craw. Lucas Menendez was named Lucas Menendez because he had a godfather who was one of the Menendez clan, which was an important family, and they had money, and they invested in cattle ranching and gave lots of lavish gifts to the Timucua chief. So Lucas Menendez liked the previous Spanish governors and sure didn't like this guy. Anyway, in addition, the governor kept sending the exact same number of labor draft orders to St. Augustine, or to the mission villages, even after a 1654-55 epidemic that Lucas Menendez said that he lost half of his province. It may just mean half of the productive labor, but nonetheless, he said half of his province dropped dead in that one epidemic. And there had been previous ones that even killed Spaniards in 49. But the point is that the governor kept pressing the Timucua province for laborers without giving any relaxation. Then, Rebolledo had also set himself up for failure by a variety of means. Number one, he was taking illicitly royal property. He even took a cannon, supposedly, and melted it down to create axes and tools he could then trade with the Ais Indians to barter for ambergris. And I know this because I went through the trial of Rebolledo's son, because he had died, but they tried the son anyway. And there were lists of all the ounces of ambergris that all the various people who were cronies of Rebolledo had received, and then sold without paying taxes. I mean, it was all under it was an illicit activity. Anyway, the point, though, is that in addition, he didn't keep up the fort. He operated a clothing store, again, illicitly, used sailors' pay to buy the materials, then sell it back to them at outrageous prices. He was heavily corrupt. Another thing he did was that he burned the Oconee mission, which was in the Okefenokee Swamp, different group of Oconee than in Georgia. But in the Okefenokee Swamp, he wanted them to move to St. Augustine to repopulate. And when they refused, he sent soldiers and he burned their town, and that was just before this rebellion happened. So word had doubtless spread among the Timucua that that Rebolledo was kind of a loose cannon. So finally, the immediate cause of the rebellion was that in the situation that I just set up for you, an English fleet descended on Jamaica and conquered it from the Spanish, took it. And word got out to the various governors of the provinces in the New World that there was an English fleet out there that had just taken Jamaica in 1655, and their next target, one of the suppositions was that it was Florida, because it was poorly defended. So the instant Governor Rebolledo received word of that, he sent out word, and I'll show you this momentarily, to draft a standing Indian militia, bring in warriors to help back up the Spanish soldiers, of which there were fewer than there should have been, and to reconstruct the fort. He quickly put the fort walls back in good shape, etc. So he was essentially caught with his pants down. He didn't have a way to protect St. Augustine without native help. And he found out that in previous governors had solicited help from the natives and seemed to work out fine for them. So he drafted them. That's a letter, actually, that was sent to the lieutenant out in Appalachia, Antonio de Sartucha, who was one of 3 soldiers stationed in Appalachia at the time. That's the original letter. It looks burned because it was burned in the Archive of the Indies in the 1920s. I spent 3 months poring through these pages, with little bits and pieces of the document sort of falling off. Fortunately, they were the blackened ones. The point, though, is that this is the letter that more or less started it all. It was included in his trial. And it basically orders all of the chiefs in Appalachia and in Timucua to gather up as much corn as they could, and everybody that came should be a warrior, which means the chiefs came too, and nobody could bring a bearer or a burden bearer, because there wasn't enough corn in St. Augustine to feed all the new Indians. So every Indian who was drafted in the militia had to bring his own corn. Now, what he didn't understand or didn't care about is that chiefs in the Timucua culture and in most Southeastern Indians cultures were nobles. They did not do manual labor. They would fight. They would dress up as warriors and go out and fight, but they sure wouldn't double over their backs and to carry 75-pound sacks of corn. And it's strange to think hundreds of people had died in the labor draft and diseases, thousands probably, and nothing provoked a rebellion until the chiefs were dissed. All right, so what happened in the rebellion is in 1656, of course, he sent the order. A soldier was sent out to deliver the order, and the Indians very quickly apparently decided to conspire and put together a rebellion. And there's far more detail to this than I can go over, but I would refer you to my book or various other accounts of it. But 7 individuals were eventually murdered. I'll show you the locations in a moment. Doesn't seem like much, but at the end of this murder spree, only 2 soldiers were left in Appalachia. All the friars had been let go, but they were told to leave. And in the end, St. Augustine was cut off from its beloved Appalachia. And the Appalachia were still on the side of the Spanish, but the Timucua had rebelled. So eventually, governor sent orders to Wale to would bring them with their warrior people with their weapons. Then he disarmed them and sent them home. He even told the Wali chief to kiss him in the behind, which was actually reported. That's kind of rare. Anyway, and then finally in September, why do you think he waited between April and September to send soldiers and quell the rebellion? He needed the soldiers in St. Augustine if the fleet came. Why did he send them in St. Augustine in September? Hurricane season. No English fleet would come and descend on St. Augustine by September, so it was like, okay, I'm safe for a while, I can send them out. So in the end, ultimately, he sent soldiers and they pacified. Let me just show you a walk through real quick. There's the route of the guy delivering the bad news, and here's where the various murders occurred. The chief, ironically, had sent a letter to his buddy, Don Juan Menendez, son of his godfather, in Timucua, saying, don't come out to the interior, we're about to murder a bunch of guys. The Indian who delivered it, however, didn't know that, and he eventually lied as to the contents. Don Juan didn't read Timucua, so the letter that had intended to keep him from coming out didn't work, and he ended up showing up. And so Don Juan shows up with 20 warriors to murder everybody at La Chua, and he sees his friend, so he grabs him by the arm and pulls him out, and then he lets his warriors flood in and slaughter as many people as they found. 2 African slaves and a Spanish servant. No, a Spanish soldier. Anyway, at the end, Rebolledo sent Cañizares. They went out. The rebels had actually built a palisade near a town called Machava, which I don't think we have archaeologically. I know we don't have the fort. It should be up on one of the little hills somewhere near Madison or Perry or somewhere in that vicinity. Eventually, they conducted a ruse. They got all the chiefs out together to conduct negotiations with the Spanish, and they captured them. They just sprung a trap, and they captured them with no bloodshed. But then they strung them up along the road as examples. That's the way the Spanish, they would execute a person, and then they would leave them up there as an example. And it was illegal to bring down the bodies. So what did the governor do? Well, after killing all of the main Timucua missions chiefs, he then took the small faction of northern towns that did not participate in the rebellion, which is interesting because they were sort of under the control of the Timucua, but they didn't choose to participate. One of the things is that their remoteness may have meant that they weren't that irritated at the Spanish, but everybody along the roads, the main southward roads, seems to have been quite ready to rebel. So what the governor did was he brought all of those towns down, and he resettled them in here, and he emplaced them as the new chiefs. So Governor Rebolledo chopped off the Timucuan nobility, replaced them and put them into the old towns where the rebel chiefs had been, and what he did was he ended up with a system that looked like that. So the Camino Real, the royal road, ran directly, more or less, from St. Augustine to Apalachee. So Timucua, which had been under the pressure of being an intervening, less important province, was now just an intervening, less important province that was a series of way stations. And so all the outlying towns were drawn together, and in the end, you ended up with a string or a chain of missions at roughly even distributions. They eventually put a new mission in here to fill in that gap. And that's what the result was that the governor used the opportunity to resettle everyone so that now what we have is most of these villages are not, or at least a lot of them, are not in their original homelands. They have no traditional claim to the lands they're living on, and furthermore, they're directly under the watchful eye of the Spaniards. So far from achieving its goals, the Timucuan Rebellion ended up creating a great opportunity for the Spanish to force the Timucua into the new system. So that's the end-up result, at least, and that is one of the reasons why the Timucuan Rebellion was hugely important, because it reconfigured the entire geography of the Timucua interior. It allowed more frequent and more safe communication between Apalachee and St. Augustine, and Apalachee produced 3,000 to 4,000 arrobas of corn, each of which is 25,000 pounds. I'm trying to calculate that in my mind. Anyway, Apalachee was far more important to the Spanish than the Timucua were, and the only reason they even wanted the Timucua to remain there is because they needed a place to stay every night when they traveled. I mean, I'm sounding, that's not what the friars wanted. The friars were far more interested, honestly, in the people, but of course they were the ones that were not killed, right? The Timucuans spared them specifically. All right, well, in that, I'm finished. You got any questions? I should point out that There's so much detail to all of this that I wish I could have said more. Lots of interesting anecdotes, but you can't understand the rebellion without doing all this big picture stuff. So I guess my point is, wow, I wish I could have told you more.
John, did they make any pottery? You mentioned clay up in the northern part that was fertile soil. Did they make pottery?
The Mission Indians, actually all of the Southeastern Indians, had a very robust ceramic potting tradition that dated back, by the time the Spanish arrived, 2,500 years plus in most areas. And not only that, the native groups in the missions produced, and they continued producing their own indigenous ceramics right through the end of the mission system. They did not adopt Spanish ceramics, but not only that, they increased their production so much so that they actually, all the presidios of West Florida and Pensacola and St. Augustine have roughly half of their own pottery. The Spanish pottery is native. So the Indians were supplying not only themselves, but they were supplying the Spanish. And for high-class people in the Spanish realm, they would actually create plates and what we call colonaware. But it's a very small percentage. Most of the ceramics that the natives were selling to the Spanish were just basically pots that they would have made anyway, but they made some money off of them by selling them to the Spanish.
My second question is, what did the Ayi Indians do with ambergris?
That is an interesting question. Let's put it this way. I know that I'm just trying to remember. I mean, the Spanish were using it as for perfume. I mean, it was an element of perfume. It's the nuance, I think it's inside the skull of the whale. The ambergris that the natives were collecting, I honestly don't know. It might have been used as Jerry, do you have any idea what indigenous use might have been?
I thought that it was just collecting it to sell to the trade to the Spaniards as a money-making operation.
Well, that's sort of my implication there too. I would assume the same thing, is that essentially the Spaniards probably noticed the presence of ambergris all along the shores, and once they noticed it, they started collecting it. The Indians got the idea. The Ais, of course, were they had been diving on Spanish shipwrecks and pulling up, silver and everything else they could get, including Spanish captives for decades by that time. But by the late 16th century, the entire East Coast was being frequented by Cuban ships and Florida ships. There was even an order saying that Cuban ships couldn't go there without the Florida governor's permission. So it had been going on for a long time. But I think in this sense, it's just a new product that the Ais suddenly had value for, and they used it to their advantage by trading to any passing ship that brought stuff.
No other questions?
I love your maps. Have you ever tried to plot along those maps as well with the growing Spanish private ranches that were emerging in this area? Because, of course, one of the things they do in the revolt is they slaughter thousands of cattle.
Yeah, I didn't say that when the place where the 2 African slaves were killed and the chief was there, they killed all humans, and they slaughtered the entire ranch because it was a cattle ranch, one of the earliest ones. That was the deal that was made with Lucas Menendez.
So I guess the question is, how much do you think this revolt is also to do with the competition between the mission communities and the growing ranches that are drawing labor out of those missions, and Timucua Indians are working on these private ranches, much to the irritation of their caciques?
I don't think it has much to do with this rebellion, and the reason is that there's 2 kinds of ranches, and most of those types of ranches show up in the 1670s later, after all of this has happened. There are cattle ranches, which are established in Gainesville by the 1620s. Cattle ranching is not labor intensive. In fact, it's very, very few people are required to manage it. And it requires lots of land with very few people. So the deal that was made was that in the eastern part of Timucua, in this area, you see the first evidence of Spanish private investment. And actually it was embezzled money that the governor was using, but that's neither here nor there. Anyway, the point is that the private investment was for low labor demand cattle ranching. The one time that the Spaniards set up in 1649 a wheat farm at Asile, the governor decided it was a good thing to farm wheat out there. Within 2 years, you have the chief, Manuel of the Asile, writing about the incredible labor demands. They're not getting paid enough. So the labor demand of a farm, the agriculture was absolutely demanding, and in fact, that was the last time they did it in the interior. Then they just basically afterwards focused on cattle ranching. So my point, though, is that later you see lots of expansion. And in answer to your original question, I want to eventually incorporate the ranches, because eventually there are ranches all the way from here to here, all the way down in here. I mean, basically, actually, this entire segment was divvied up as ranches by 1763. But basically, as the people died off and relocated and consolidated, the ranchers moved in. What happened in this case is that the ranchers, I think, were dealing with the Lucas Menendez's family quite nicely. They were happy because they got lots of gifts. We find cow bones and pig bones on the missions, which I suspect are actually products off the local ranches. So my point is that ultimately it wasn't as much of a pressure and it wasn't irritating to them unless the flow of gifts and preferential treatment stopped. And that's pretty much what Rebolledo did. I mean, Rebolledo was the one that Lucas Menendez wanted to come back and, not to come back, but to leave. And when the new governor came in 6 years, which was the term of a Spanish governor, then they'd come back and allow the Spaniards to get in. But he deliberately spared the ranch owner and, well, killed all the cattle, but he deliberately spared his friend. Anyway, long answer to a short question, but the demands of labor were far more on farming than they were on ranches, which makes the ranching a perfect thing for this kind of situation. Later, they did get irritated by cows eating their palmetto berries, but that's much later, 20 years after the rebellion. Any other questions? All right, thanks.